Welcome to Unit 13 of the TESOL course at Southern Utah University. In a previous video, we talked about how the 4 strands of language learning help us plan out a series of lessons. In this video, we'll focus more on how do we plan an individual lesson. We'll answer the question, why does lesson planning matter? We'll talk about objectives, and then we'll talk about 4 basic steps or stages of a good lesson plan. So why do we lesson plan? Most important reason to lesson plan is to support student learning. Better lessons generally lead to better student language learning. Another reason to lesson plan is that it helps build students' confidence that we're a good teacher. If we have a good lesson plan, it's going to show through, and students will have more confidence to believe what we teach because it's well organized. Also, the idea of planning lessons helps us develop and improve our teaching skills. The truth is, most experienced teachers do not go and plan out a detailed lesson for every lesson they teach. But they did it when they were new teachers, and that helped them internalize the stages of good lesson planning so that they can go in and teach a lesson with a much smaller amount of preparation but still have an effective lesson that helps students learn and builds students' confidence in the teacher. Let's first start by talking about objectives. Objectives, there's different names for them. Sometimes we call them outcomes or goals or aims. Some people would say that there's a difference between each of these terms, but that's really getting maybe a little more narrow. It's enough to say that objectives are things that help clarify the purpose of the lesson for the student, and it's also helpful, it clarifies it for the teacher. And having an objective helps students know what they should be able to do with the language at the conclusion of the lesson or the unit or the experience. And there's lots of different opinions about what language should be used to describe objectives, but in general, some good advice is they should be learner-centered. They're most helpful when a learner can look at the objective and know what they need to be able to do. They should also include maybe some conditions, under what conditions could the learner do this. There's lots of other advice, but in general, I think it's just think about what do you want the student to be able to do at the conclusion of the lesson. So some examples, here's one for maybe writing, send a text to a friend, inviting the friend to a party. Here's one for reading, summarize a series of events from a newspaper article. Here's one for listening, identify the main idea of a political speech. And the speaking one, give correct time when asked, what time is it? Okay, all of these are student focused. As we mentioned, there are some different ways to describe the main stages or components of a lesson, but these 4 I think really capture the main important parts of any lesson. A warm-up, presentation, practice, and then assessment. So in the warm-up stage, the point here is to get students back to thinking in the language, especially if they are using other languages in their daily life. The warm-up gets their brains and their minds focused again on English. It also, a good idea during the warm-up is to make a connection to previous lessons or previous material. Here's what we talked about before. Here's where we're going to go today. Many teachers will use the warm-up to engage students in the lesson topic, maybe something that's a hook or an interest. Get them focused, interested, back into the classroom and ready to learn. Then we go to the presentation part. In the presentation, we explain the purpose of the lesson. Learners should know what the objective is. This is where we give instructions on how to use the language. We may do some modeling and scaffolding with how to use the language. Then we move into the practice stage. In the practice stage, the students now have a chance to apply what the teacher has taught them in the presentation stage. And while students are applying the language, the teacher observes the students, can support them with feedback. Sometimes practice happens in class, sometimes it happens outside of class for homework. And the teacher will continue monitoring their progress. Students will continue practicing what they've seen the teacher model and the scaffolding that the teacher gave them. Then at some point we want to do some assessment. Now briefly I just want to mention the difference between formative assessment and summative assessment. Formative assessment is usually done before the student is finished. before the student has achieved the objective. And the goal here is just to see how are students doing with experimenting and trying out the language. Are they able to do this on their own? Where do they struggle with? The goal is to inform the teacher on how well the students are doing as they practice. Summative assessment is usually done at the end of an experience. This could be the test, the final exam, something where students are leaving and the teacher's not going to be there to teach them anymore. When we think about lesson planning, most of the assessment is that formative type of assessment. It's not the final exam at the end of the lesson. But the purpose of the assessment is to determine what parts of the lesson students understand, or what parts of the lesson students need to review, or what does the teacher need to explain differently. Assessment helps teachers decide what kinds of additional practice might be helpful. Okay, they can do this here when I help them, or when they have this book or they have this sheet, but can they do it more independently? Do we need to have some other kinds of practice? So assessment's an important part of helping the teacher evaluate, was the objective met? Can students perform the outcome? There's lots of different ideas about how to create lesson plans. Lots of teacher education programs have templates that teachers have to follow exactly with lots of detail. It can be very exhausting to new teachers. But the idea is that it's supposed to help teachers develop these skills and integrate them into their teaching style. In general, any kind of language or lesson planning template is helpful. And you just find what works for you. But it should clearly have an objective, and it should clearly have something to do with warm-up, presentation, practice, and some kind of idea of how the student outcome is going to be assessed. So in our video, we explained the purpose of lesson plans, and we talked about those 4 main components, as well as the need for clear objectives.